participant in the conspiracy that would doom Jane Grey, believing himself to be saving England's soul even as he signed away an innocent girl's life. His death on July 6, 1553, came after weeks of agonizing illness during which he coughed blood and suffered hallucinations, but his final act was to ratify the devise for the succession that would bypass both his sisters in favor of Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey's intellectual prowess was both her greatest asset and her ultimate curse, making her an ideal candidate for manipulation by those who mistook learning for political acumen. Born into the Grey family, she was the daughter of Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and Frances Brandon, herself the daughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary. This royal bloodline, diluted though it was, became the legal foundation for her claim to the throne. From earliest childhood, Jane displayed an almost supernatural ability to absorb knowledge, mastering Latin and Greek by age 9, and engaging in theological debates that impressed Europe's leading scholars. Roger Ascham, the renowned humanist, wrote that Jane's learning exceeded that of most university graduates, but this very intelligence would blind her to the deadly game being played around her. Jane's education was revolutionary for its time, encompassing not just classical languages, but philosophy, theology, mathematics, and natural sciences. She corresponded with leading European intellectuals and could debate complex theological points in multiple languages. However, this academic excellence came at a terrible personal cost. Her parents, viewing their daughter as a political asset rather than a child, subjected her to brutal physical punishment when her studies fell short of their expectations. Jane herself later wrote of beatings so severe they left her unable to sit for days, administered by parents who saw her intelligence as a commodity to be refined through violence. This abuse created a young woman who sought approval through intellectual achievement while harboring a deep-seated fear of disappointing authority figures, traits that would make her fatally susceptible to manipulation. The architect of Jane's doom was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, a man whose political survival depended on preventing Mary Tudor's accession to the throne. Northumberland had clawed his way to power through the execution of his rival, the Duke of Somerset, and now controlled England as Lord President of the Privy Council. His network of spies and informants had made him acutely aware that Mary's accession would mean his own death, along with that of dozens of Protestant nobles who had profited from Edward VI's reign. Northumberland's solution was breathtakingly audacious. He would alter the succession itself, placing his own family on the throne through marriage to Jane Grey. The plan required the manipulation of a dying king, the coercion of a teenage girl, and the cooperation of nobles who were too frightened to resist. The marriage between Jane Grey and Guilford Dudley in May 1553 was orchestrated with military precision, designed to give Northumberland's family a direct claim to the throne, while binding the Grey family to his cause through blood ties. Jane herself was given no choice in the matter, informed of her betrothal only days before the ceremony. Contemporary witnesses described her visible distress during the wedding, noting that she appeared more like a prisoner than a bride. Guilford Dudley, Northumberland's fourth son, was himself a reluctant participant, more interested in court festivities than political intrigue. The marriage ceremony, held at Durham House with calculated magnificence, was attended by nobles who understood they were witnessing not a celebration of love, but the forging of chains that would bind them all to Northumberland's dangerous gamble. The weeks following Edward VI's death saw Northumberland's conspiracy unfold with the precision of a military campaign. Yet the seeds of its failure were visible from the beginning to those who dared to look. Jane was brought to Sion House under the pretense of visiting, only to be informed by the assembled council that she was now Queen of England. Her initial reaction was one of genuine horror. Witnesses reported that she fell to the ground in shock, crying out that the crown belonged to Mary Tudor by right. For nearly an hour, she refused to accept the crown, arguing with the very men who had orchestrated her elevation. Only when faced with arguments about her duty to preserve Protestant England and threats about the consequences of refusal did she finally, reluctantly, agree to accept the crown that would prove her death warrant. Jane's proclamation as Queen on July 10, 1553, was met with ominous silence in London's streets, a stark contrast to the joyous celebrations that had greeted previous royal announcements. The common people of London, regardless of their religious beliefs, recognized Mary Tudor as Henry VIII's legitimate daughter and rightful heir. More tellingly, many of the nobles who had publicly supported Jane's proclamation were already sending secret messages to Mary, hedging their bets against the likely failure of Northumberland's coup. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir George Barn, proclaimed Jane Queen with visible reluctance, and several aldermen refused to attend the ceremony altogether. These were not the actions of men confident in their cause, but of politicians calculating the odds of survival. Mary Tudor's escape to Kenninghall in Norfolk represented the first crack in Northumberland's carefully constructed plan, transforming what should have been a swift political coup into a dangerous war of attrition. Mary had been warned of the conspiracy by sympathetic court officials and had fled London before she could be arrested. From her stronghold in East Anglia, she began issuing her own proclamations, declaring herself the rightful queen and calling on all loyal subjects to support her claim. More importantly, she began gathering military forces, attracting not just Catholic nobles, but Protestant landowners who valued legitimacy over religious reform. Within days of Jane's proclamation, Mary had assembled a force of several thousand men, growing larger by the hour as news of her cause spread across the countryside. The 9 days of Jane's reign were marked by a series of increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control as support ebbed away with each passing hour. Jane herself, despite her youth and inexperience, began to show remarkable political acumen, recognizing that her supposed allies were preparing to abandon her. In a display of royal authority that surprised her councillors, she refused Guildford Dudley's demand to be crowned king, declaring that she alone held royal authority and would not share it with a husband she barely knew. When several council members attempted to leave the Tower to raise forces for her cause, Jane ordered the gates locked, effectively making prisoners of her own government. This bold move demonstrated both her growing understanding of her precarious position and her determination not to go quietly to her fate. The psychological pressure on Jane during these 9 days was immense as she watched her supporters melt away while maintaining the facade of royal confidence. Contemporary accounts describe her conducting herself with remarkable dignity, holding court in the Tower's royal apartments, while fully aware that she was surrounded by men who had placed their own survival above loyalty to her cause. She continued her scholarly pursuits even while wearing the crown, reading Greek texts and engaging in theological discussions with visiting clerics. This intellectual routine provided her with emotional anchor in the chaos surrounding her, but it also isolated her from the practical political maneuvering that might have saved her throne. Her tutors had prepared her to rule through moral authority and intellectual superiority, not through the brutal calculations of Renaissance power politics. The Tower of London, during Jane's brief reign, became a stage for one of history's most macabre political dramas, with the young queen literally imprisoned within the walls that were supposed to be her palace. The Tower's constable, Sir John Bridges, found himself in the impossible position of serving a queen whose authority was evaporating by the hour. Jane's daily routine involved reviewing state papers that grew more ominous each day, as reports arrived of nobles defecting to Mary's cause and of Northumberland's military expedition faltering in the countryside. She signed documents with the royal signature Jane the Queen, each stroke of the pen a defiant assertion of authority that she must have known was becoming increasingly hollow. The irony was not lost on observers that England's queen was effectively a prisoner, unable to leave the fortress that had become both her palace and her jail. Northumberland's military expedition to capture Mary Tudor represented the final gamble of a desperate man, but it was doomed from the start by the loyalty crisis that had already undermined Jane's reign. Taking a force of approximately 2,000 men, Northumberland marched toward East Anglia with the confidence of a man who had controlled English politics for years. However, his army began deserting almost immediately, as soldiers and officers alike recognized that they were fighting against the legitimate heir to the throne. Local populations refused to provide supplies or assistance, forcing Northumberland's men to forage like common bandits. By the time he reached Cambridge, his force had shrunk to fewer than 200 loyal retainers, and he faced Mary's army of nearly 20,000 supporters. The speed of this military collapse reflected the broader rejection of Jane's claim by the English people. The Privy Council's betrayal of Jane on July 19, 1553, was executed with a cynical efficiency that shocked even seasoned observers of Tudor politics. Led by the Earl of Arundel and the Earl of Pembroke, the councillors who had proclaimed Jane Queen just 9 days earlier now raced to abandon her cause and save their own lives. The scene in the Tower's council chamber was one of calculated treachery, as men who had sworn loyalty to Jane now declared Mary Tudor the rightful queen with the same ceremony they had once used to elevate Jane. When Jane was informed of their decision, she reportedly received the news with remarkable composure, stating simply that she was relieved to lay down the crown that had brought her nothing but sorrow. Her dignity in defeat stood in stark contrast to the scrambling panic of the nobles, who had used her for their own purposes. Jane's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, provided perhaps the most painful betrayal of all when he personally tore down the proclamations of his daughter's reign from the Tower's walls. Contemporary witnesses described the Duke's frantic efforts to distance himself from his daughter's cause, ripping down the very documents that had declared her queen while shouting proclamations of loyalty to Mary Tudor. This act of paternal betrayal was both practically necessary for his own survival and symbolically devastating, representing the complete abandonment of Jane by the very family that had pushed her toward the throne. The Duke's actions demonstrated the brutal calculus of Tudor politics, where family bonds counted for nothing when weighed against personal survival. Jane watched from her window as her father destroyed the last visible symbols of her brief reign, understanding that she was now completely alone. Mary Tudor's triumphant entry into London on August 3, 1553, marked not just the end of Jane's reign, but the beginning of a new phase of uncertainty about the young former queen's fate. Mary's procession through the capital was met with genuine enthusiasm from crowds who celebrated the restoration of legitimate monarchy, but the new queen faced immediate pressure from her supporters to execute those who had usurped her throne. Initially, Mary showed remarkable clemency, recognizing that Jane had been manipulated by older and more experienced politicians. The new queen's first instinct was to treat Jane as a victim rather than a perpetrator, ordering that she be held in comfortable confinement while her case was considered. This mercy reflected both Mary's naturally forgiving nature and her political calculation that executing a teenage girl might create unwanted sympathy for her cause. The Tower of London's transformation from Jane's palace to her prison represented one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in English royal history. The same rooms where she had held court as queen now became her jail. The same servants who had bowed to her authority now served as her guards. Jane was housed in the gentleman jailer's lodgings, comfortable quarters that reflected her continued royal status even in captivity. Her daily routine involved prayer, study, and correspondence with family members and religious advisors, maintaining the scholarly discipline that had defined her life before her unwilling elevation to the throne. Contemporary accounts describe her as accepting her imprisonment with remarkable equanimity, displaying a philosophical resignation that impressed even her captors. Guildford Dudley's separate imprisonment in the Beauchamp Tower created additional emotional torment for Jane, as the couple, who had been married for political purposes, now faced potential death as a consequence of that unwanted union. Their marriage had never been consummated in any meaningful emotional sense, yet their legal bond now linked their fates inextricably. Guildford, less intellectually equipped to handle their situation than his wife, fell into periods of despair and rage that contrasted sharply with Jane's composed acceptance of their circumstances. From their separate towers, they could occasionally see each other during exercise periods, these glimpses serving as painful reminders of the normal life that political ambition had stolen from them. Their imprisonment became a cruel parody of their marriage, united in suffering rather than in love. The execution of Northumberland in August 1553 served as a grim preview of what might await Jane and her husband, demonstrating Mary's willingness to shed blood when political necessity demanded it. Northumberland's final days were marked by a pathetic attempt to save his life through conversion to Catholicism, a desperate move that fooled no one and earned him contempt from both Protestant and Catholic observers. His public recantation of Protestant beliefs on the scaffold was seen as cowardly, even by those who supported his execution, and it served as a warning to other conspirators that Mary would not be swayed by deathbed conversions. Northumberland's head, displayed on London Bridge according to tradition, became a gruesome reminder of the price of failed political ambition. For Jane, watching from the tower, her father-in-law's death represented the first indication that Mary's mercy might have limits. Mary's initial reluctance to execute Jane created a period of agonizing uncertainty for the imprisoned former queen, who understood that her survival depended entirely on the new queen's continued clemency. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1553, various political and religious figures interceded on Jane's behalf, arguing that her youth and obvious manipulation by others should save her from the ultimate penalty. Mary herself seemed genuinely conflicted about Jane's fate, reportedly weeping when the subject was discussed in council meetings. The Queen's Catholic advisors were divided. Some argued that mercy would demonstrate the superior virtue of Catholic rule, while others insisted that all threats to the throne must be eliminated regardless of the perpetrator's age or circumstances. This internal debate within Mary's government kept Jane alive but in constant fear, never knowing whether each day might be her last. The Protestant rebellion led by Sir Thomas Wyatt in early 1554 sealed Jane's fate with the cold logic of political necessity, transforming her from a symbol of past mistakes into a present danger to Mary's reign. Wyatt's uprising was ostensibly about opposing Mary's planned marriage to Philip II of Spain, but it quickly became a focal point for Protestant resistance to Catholic restoration. Although Jane had no connection to Wyatt's conspiracy and indeed condemned it from her prison, her very existence provided a banner around which future rebellions might rally. The rebels' rallying cry of restoring the rightful Protestant queen referred directly to Jane, making her a living symbol of resistance, whether she wished to be or not. Mary's advisors made it clear that as long as Jane lived, she would remain a potential figurehead for every discontented Protestant in England. Henry Grey's participation in Wyatt's rebellion represented the final, fatal mistake that condemned his daughter to death, demonstrating how one man's political miscalculation could doom his entire family. Grey had been pardoned for his role in Jane's elevation, but his involvement with Wyatt showed that he had learned nothing from his previous brush with death. Contemporary accounts suggest that Grey was motivated more by desperation than calculation, believing that only a successful rebellion could save his daughter's life. However, his participation in the uprising provided Mary's government with the justification it needed to move against Jane, arguing that the Grey family remained an active threat to the realm's stability. When Grey was captured after the rebellion's failure, he had effectively signed his daughter's death warrant along with his own. The trial of Jane Grey for high treason was a legal formality that provided constitutional cover for a politically necessary execution, but it also offered a final glimpse of the remarkable character that had made her both a suitable candidate for manipulation and ultimately a dangerous symbol for her enemies. Jane conducted herself with dignity throughout the proceedings, pleading guilty to the charges while maintaining that she had never desired the crown that proved her undoing. Her legal defense, such as it was, rested on her youth and the coercion she had faced from older conspirators, but everyone present understood that the verdict had been predetermined by political necessity rather than legal precedent. The trial's most poignant moment came when Jane was asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, and she replied simply that she hoped God would forgive those who had brought her to this pass, as she had already forgiven them herself. Mary's final decision to execute Jane was made with genuine reluctance, but iron resolve, representing the triumph of political calculation over personal mercy in the harsh world of Tudor statecraft. Contemporary accounts describe the Queen as visibly distressed when signing Jane's death warrant, understanding that she was ordering the execution of someone who had been more sinned against than sinning. However, Mary's advisors were unanimous in their counsel that Jane's continued existence posed an unacceptable risk to the realm's stability and the Queen's own survival. The precedent was clear from English history. Potential rivals to the throne, regardless of their personal innocence or complicity, could not be allowed to live if they posed any threat to the established order. Mary's decision, while personally agonizing, reflected the brutal realities of monarchical power in the 16th century. Jane's final weeks were marked by intensive religious discussions with Dr. John Feckenham, Mary's personal chaplain, in a last-ditch attempt to save the young woman's soul, if not her life. These theological debates, meticulously recorded by witnesses, reveal Jane's formidable intellectual capacity and unwavering Protestant convictions even in the face of death. Feckenham, a learned and genuinely compassionate man, hoped that converting Jane to Catholicism might yet provide grounds for clemency. But he found himself intellectually outmatched by a teenager whose command of scripture and theological argument exceeded that of many university-trained divines. Jane's refusal to compromise her religious beliefs, even when such compromise might have saved her life, demonstrated the same intellectual integrity that had marked her entire brief existence. These final debates became a posthumous testament to her character, showing a young woman who chose martyrdom over apostasy with full understanding of the consequences. The scaffold preparations on Tower Green represented the final gruesome stage management of Jane's execution, designed to provide the dignity appropriate to royal blood while ensuring the effective elimination of a political threat. The execution site within the tower's walls, rather than on the public hill where common traitors died, reflected both Mary's respect for Jane's royal status and her desire to avoid creating a public spectacle that might generate sympathy for the condemned girl. The scaffold itself was draped in black cloth, with fresh straw scattered to absorb the blood that would soon flow. The executioner, his identity lost to history, prepared his axe with the professional care of a craftsman, understanding that a clean, swift death was both a mercy to the victim and a demonstration of the crown's dignified authority. Every detail was calculated to emphasize both the solemnity of royal justice and the finality of its verdict. Jane's final mourning began with the spiritual preparations of a deeply religious young woman facing the ultimate test of her faith, demonstrating the same intellectual discipline that had marked her scholarly pursuits. She rose early, dressed carefully in the black garments of mourning, and spent hours in prayer and meditation with her prayer book. Contemporary witnesses noted her remarkable composure as she prepared for death, showing none of the hysteria or despair that might have been expected from someone so young facing such a fate. Her personal servants, themselves moved to tears by her dignity, helped her arrange her hair so that her neck would be easily accessible to the executioner's axe. Jane's attention to these practical details reflected her characteristic thoroughness. Even in death, she would do things properly and with appropriate consideration for others who would witness her final moments. The walk from Jane's prison quarters to the scaffold represented the final act of a tragedy that had begun with ambitious nobles' political calculations and would end with a teenager's blood on Tower Green. Jane was accompanied by two ladies-in-waiting, Dr. Feckenham and the Tower's officials, a small procession that moved with solemn dignity through the fortress that had served as both her palace and her prison. Witnesses noted that her step never faltered. Her voice remained steady as she spoke final words of comfort to those who accompanied her, and her demeanor suggested someone walking to prayer rather than execution. The short distance from her quarters to the scaffold must have seemed both endless and terrifyingly brief, each step bringing her closer to the death that political necessity had made inevitable. Her composure during this final walk became legendary, inspiring both Protestant martyrologists and Catholic observers who grudgingly admired her courage. Jane's final speech on the scaffold has been preserved by multiple witnesses and stands as one of the most remarkable documents of courage in the face of injustice in English history. Speaking in a clear, strong voice that carried to all present, she acknowledged her legal guilt while maintaining her moral innocence, explaining that she had never desired the crown but had accepted it out of obedience to those she had been taught to respect. She forgave all those who had brought her to this end, explicitly including Queen Mary, and asked for prayers for her soul and for England's future prosperity. Most remarkably, she used her final public moments to deliver what was essentially a scholarly theological discourse, explaining her Protestant beliefs with the same intellectual rigor she had brought to all her studies. Her speech lasted several minutes and demonstrated not just courage, but a formidable intellect that remained sharp even in the face of imminent death. The mechanics of royal execution by beheading involved specific protocols designed to maintain dignity while ensuring effective elimination of the condemned, and Jane's adherence to these procedures showed her determination to die as she had lived, with proper attention to duty and form. She was instructed to kneel before the block and place her neck in the groove, worn smooth by previous victims, positioning herself carefully to provide the executioner with the clearest possible target. Contemporary accounts differ on whether she requested a blindfold or chose to face death with open eyes, but all agree that she showed no fear as she assumed the prescribed position. Her final words, spoken in a voice that reportedly never wavered, were taken from Psalm 51, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner, following professional protocol, waited for her to signal her readiness before raising his axe for the single stroke that would end the life of England's most reluctant monarch. The execution itself was completed with the professional efficiency that marked the difference between honorable death and butchery, bringing Jane's suffering to an immediate and merciful end. The executioner's single stroke severed her neck cleanly, avoiding the multiple blows that characterized botched executions and spared Jane the prolonged agony that had marked some royal deaths. Witnesses reported that her death was instantaneous, her body showing none of the convulsions that sometimes followed less skillful executions. The blood that flowed onto the scaffold's black cloth represented not just the end of one young life, but the conclusion of a political crisis that had threatened to tear England apart. Her head, lifted briefly for the traditional display to the assembled witnesses, showed a face that even in death retained the intellectual intensity that had marked her living features. The executioner's pronouncement of "Behold the head of a traitor," rang hollow to many present, who saw in Jane's death the elimination of a threat rather than the punishment of a criminal. The immediate aftermath of Jane's execution was marked by an unusual silence from the small crowd of witnesses, many of whom seemed stunned by what they had witnessed rather than satisfied by the administration of justice. Unlike executions of genuinely hated figures, which often prompted cheers or expressions of satisfaction, Jane's death was met with solemn quiet that spoke to the complex emotions her case had generated. Even Mary's supporters struggled to celebrate the execution of someone so young and obviously manipulated by others, while Protestant observers began immediately to construct the martyrological narrative that would make Jane a symbol of religious persecution. The practical business of disposing of her remains proceeded with respectful efficiency. Her body was wrapped in clean cloth and carried to the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula for burial among other victims of Tudor justice. Jane's burial in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was conducted with simple dignity, but without the elaborate ceremonies that had marked her brief coronation, reflecting her transition from queen to traitor in official memory. The chapel, which already housed the remains of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and other victims of royal politics, received Jane's body with the quiet reverence appropriate to sacred ground that had seen too much political bloodshed. No elaborate monument marked her resting place, no inscription commemorated her brief reign or scholarly achievements. She was laid to rest as Lady Jane Dudley, her married name reflecting the political alliance that had doomed her rather than the royal title she had briefly held. The simplicity of her burial stood in stark contrast to the complexity of the political maneuvering that had brought her to this end, reducing a brilliant young woman to just another casualty of Tudor dynastic politics. The European reaction to Jane's execution revealed the international dimensions of her case, as Protestant and Catholic powers interpreted her death according to their own religious and political agendas. Protestant rulers and theologians across Northern Europe seized upon Jane's execution as evidence of Catholic cruelty, using her death to justify their own resistance to Catholic influence. John Calvin himself wrote of Jane as a martyr, whose scholarly achievements and religious devotion had made her worthy of a better fate than execution at the hands of religious enemies. Catholic observers, while generally supporting Mary's political decision, expressed discomfort at the optics of executing such a young and obviously manipulated victim. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Mary's cousin, reportedly advised against the execution, but accepted its necessity for political stability. Jane's death thus became a propaganda weapon in the broader religious conflicts that were tearing Europe apart in the 16th century. The creation of Jane's martyrological legacy began almost immediately after her execution, as Protestant writers began constructing the narrative that would transform her from failed usurper to innocent victim of Catholic persecution. John Fox's Acts and Monuments, the most influential Protestant martyrology of the period, devoted extensive coverage to Jane's case, emphasizing her youth, intelligence, and religious devotion, while downplaying the political calculations that had brought her to the throne. Fox's account, widely read throughout Protestant Europe, established the template for Jane's reputation that would influence historical writing for centuries. The martyrological narrative required some creative editing of historical facts. Jane's scholarly achievements were emphasized while her family's political ambitions were minimized, and her religious debates with Dr. Feckenham were presented as evidence of her superior Protestant theology, rather than simply intellectual stubbornness. Jane's impact on the development of English queenship extended far beyond her 9 days on the throne, establishing precedents and expectations that would influence both Mary and Elizabeth I in their subsequent reigns. Her brief reign had demonstrated that a woman could claim royal authority in her own right, rather than simply serving as regent for male heirs, a principle that proved crucial when Mary herself took the throne, and later when Elizabeth inherited the crown. Jane's scholarly reputation also helped establish the expectation that female rulers should be intellectually accomplished, contributing to the Renaissance ideal of the learned princess that Elizabeth would later embody so successfully. Even Jane's execution served a purpose in this development, as her dignified death became a model for how royal women should face adversity with courage, faith, and intellectual integrity intact. The broader constitutional implications of Jane's case influenced English legal and political thought for generations, raising questions about the nature of legitimate authority and the relationship between legal right and popular acceptance. Her failed reign demonstrated that mere legal documentation was insufficient to establish royal authority without broader popular support, a lesson that would influence the development of constitutional monarchy in England. The ease with which the Privy Council abandoned Jane's cause and switched to Mary showed the fragility of authority based solely on fear and political calculation, while Mary's initial popularity demonstrated the continued importance of dynastic legitimacy in English political culture. These lessons would prove crucial during later constitutional crises, as English political theorists grappled with questions about the source and limits of royal authority. Jane's scholarly legacy survived her political failure, inspiring generations of educational reformers who saw in her intellectual achievements proof of women's capacity for learning and leadership. Her correspondence with European humanists, her theological writings, and the recorded debates from her final days provided evidence that challenged contemporary assumptions about female intellectual capacity. Renaissance educators used Jane's example to argue for expanded educational opportunities for noble women, while Protestant reformers pointed to her scholarly achievements as evidence of their religion's superior approach to learning and spiritual development. Her personal library, confiscated after her execution, revealed the breadth of her intellectual interests and provided a model for the education of future generations of aristocratic women. Even Catholic educators, while rejecting her religious conclusions, acknowledged the impressive scope of her learning and the quality of her theological arguments. The romanticization of Jane Grey in later centuries transformed her from a complex historical figure